Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Logos Project. This is your host, Dom, and in today's video, I'm joined once again by John Salza and a new guest, Dan Kavic. Dan, how you doing? John, how you doing?
I'm good.
Great to be with you.
Wonderful. Well, for any returning viewers, John, could you give a quick introduction to yourself and your work?
Sure, I'm a Catholic apologist and author. I've been playing that game for quite a while, going on 25 years, and I'm also a lay Dominican of the Central Province for St. Albert the Great.
Wonderful. And Dan here is a newcomer. He's a graduate from Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, where he received a bachelor's of arts with a minor in psychology, and he's an IT professional and an ex-Sedevacantist. Dan, welcome to the club. Basically, how you doing?
Thank you. And it's great to be with you guys tonight. Great to be with our audience, and I'm looking forward to sharing the story with everybody.
Excellent, wonderful. Yeah, so let's kick it off. So Dan, you used to be part of the Society St. Pius X as well as a Sedevacantist, but you've through reading John's book and through your research have moved away from those theological positions. So could you maybe share a little bit about the background of how you kind of came to those conclusions, left that, and all of that stuff, if that makes sense?
Sure. And if you don't mind, I do want to share the beginning of how this all began as well, just so that people understand that the internet can cause it can cause a lot of problems for somebody who's trying to seek out the truth, unfortunately, in this day and age. So, but to begin, I'll keep it as short as possible. I don't want to, go through 9 years of my life in, an hour here. It's going to be tough to do that. But so it all began in the spring of 2013, where, I had at the time not really been attending Mass regularly. I had explored Protestant churches, went on and off to those churches. And then all of a sudden, one day I was just walking, outside during my lunch break at work. And I guess it was God saying to me, hey, you know what? You've never been to a Latin Mass. It's the one thing you've never done. And, I was like, well, you know what? I want to see what Latin Masses are around the area. And I started to look around. And at the time, I was looking into Bitcoin as well. So I was doing research on Bitcoin because there was all this hype about Bitcoin, especially back in 2013. So I actually ended up hearing about this programmer that helps develop the blockchain for Bitcoin that was embedding Catholic references into his code for the Bitcoin blockchain. So I was curious about this guy. I'm like, well, who is this guy? I want to find out more about him because I thought that was interesting. I'm like, it's pretty a public way to spread your faith and to show people that you're committed to Catholicism. So I ended up finding out that he was on this old chat network that's still out there. It's called the IRC, or Internet Relay Chat, and most people that are in IT or programmers, they know about this. It's an old chat network from the late 80s. And I ended up getting into this guy's channel, which is still out there today, by the way. I'm not encouraging anyone to go there now, but I ended up going into the channel and starting to talk with this guy. And there were about 10, 12 people that would normally be in this chat room. And one day we were talking about Francis, and all of a sudden one of the guys in there says, well, there's no Pope. He's not the Pope. And I'm like, well, what do you mean? I've never heard anybody say, there's no Pope. That's crazy. He's at the Vatican, right? So at the time I thought that was a little crazy. And so I ended up trying to just learn more about this Sedevacantism. I didn't even know how to say it properly. I'm like, Sedeva what? I don't know. I didn't even know how to pronounce it right. And I'm like, okay, well, this is interesting. I've never heard anyone just flat out say that there's no Pope. So at that time, I was looking for the Mass, a Latin Mass, and another guy in that channel that was actually an SSPX guy who was defending the society. He had recommended me to go to the society. He said, you know what, there's one actually in your area, because he asked me, like, what city are you in? And I told him, I'm in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And okay, well, there's one not that far from where you live at. So he was like, we accept the Pope. We're not out there saying that there's no Pope. And he's like, well, you should check it out. So I ended up checking out the Latin Mass at the society. It was in an old school gymnasium about 25 minutes from where I live out near the airport, actually, in Pittsburgh. And I ended up going, and I was really taken aback by the Latin Mass. I was like, wow, this is so much different than what I was used to in the Novus Ordo Missae, or the new Mass, as a lot of people call it. So I ended up started to go to the society more regularly, and they actually handed me a packet, where it had the Open Letter to Confused Catholics book, which you were both very familiar with. And, I had gone there for about a year and a half, but one of the guys that was in that chat room ended up moving to Pittsburgh, but he was a Sedevacantist. And so he asked me to go out to mass with him in Akron, Ohio one weekend. And I was like, well, you know what? I'm curious to see what this is about, what this looks like, what are these guys all about? So I was open-minded about going with him, even though at the time he knew very well I was attending the society. He actually grew up in the society originally before becoming a Sedevacantist. So, just to give you a little backstory there, I think it's important just so that people understand how this kind of all came about. And I ended up meeting the priest out in Akron, and I really liked him as far as like what he was doing as far as his practice, like encouraging people to pray the rosary. He seemed very knowledgeable. And so, for about 2 years, I'd say about 2 years, I was going back and forth between the society on weekends when it was convenient to go there, and then going out to Akron, as often as I could for mass. And, as I'm discerning through all this and trying to figure this out, I'm like, well, these guys seem to be the most conservative group, even though they're the ones that are saying there's no Pope. And, I was like, well, the society, there were some things I noticed there not too long into it, where people were saying like, hey, you shouldn't go to mass on Saturdays, just because really Sunday's the only day you should really be going to mass. And I'm like, well, doesn't it say in the 1983 Code of Canon Law, because I did a little bit of homework back then, I said, well, doesn't it say you can attend on a Saturday evening and fulfill your obligation? And they're like, yeah, you can do that, but we don't encourage it, basically. It should be on Sundays. That's how it always was. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's just a little bit of backstory to kind of get you, get the audience, everyone in the audience familiar with how this all kind of came about, how I started to get curious about Sedevacantism. And, I just...
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The context there, how you discovered the traditional Latin Mass, but also the positions of the society and eventually Sedevacantism. Now, so was it a slow process? Did you like fully adhere eventually to Sedevacantism, or did you have a time where you were kind of holding to the society's position? How did that unfold?
Well, that was really tough for me, actually. I initially, for a while there, I was sticking with the society because I had read the Open Letter to Confused Catholics book, which I'm sure you both have read. And, I was like, well, this seems to be the safe, as far as like a position, as far as recognizing the authority of a pope and, not trying to be in schism. I was like, well, this makes more sense to me right now. But I will admit that, the friend of mine that had moved up here, the Sedevacantist friend, he had explained a lot of things to me as far as what their position was. Then the priest in Akron, and he and I had many conversations over the phone, in-person dinners, about my objections or concerns about Sedevacantism. And I'll admit that they both did a really good job of selling it to me, as far as why they really believed that this was the truth, that the Catholic Church had a hierarchy that essentially fell into heresy. These people lost the faith. They're promoting a different religion. And, it was actually, as you both know, Archbishop Lefebvre who kind of coined that whole new religion phrase out there, and promoted that sort of thinking. So, I started, confiding in this priest more. And, even to this day, I have a good relationship still with him. He was actually at my house a few days ago for dinner. He stopped by randomly on his way back from Eastern Pennsylvania. I don't know if he'll continue talking with me after this video, if he hears about it or sees it. So we'll see how that plays out. But it was a tough process. I admit, I had a lot of back and forth in my mind and praying and asking God, well, is this supposed to be, your will? Do you want me to go to this group, these Sedevacantists, and go to mass with them? I was really torn about it for a number of years. And then I just kind of, I guess, caved, if you want to call it that, or accepted, hey, maybe these guys are actually right. Maybe, and then, I started having doubts about Francis, especially during, after Amoris Laetitia happened, the whole Pachamama statue incident, which we all remember. And a lot of people were disappointed in that. And unfortunately, because of that one incident, I actually had noticed more people showing up at these Sedevacantist masses. They're saying, well, we're done with Pope Francis. We're done with these modernists. These people are heretics, and just saying all these, these different things that were that didn't have a lot of substance to them, but you could easily kind of say, well, yeah, I get where they're coming from. They're just really disheartened by what's happening, and it looks like a different religion. So yeah, I was starting to really buy into it, so to speak. I wasn't 100% sold on like some of the other ones, like John Paul II, Paul VI. I had confusion about them. I even asked the Sedevacantist priest. I was like, well, can you explain to me how they weren't really popes? Like, what's your reasons behind that? And he went into a long rant about that with me one evening. And, even after that dinner, I wasn't fully convinced that they weren't popes per se, but maybe they were modernists that had possibly fallen out of the papacy because they, adhered to modernism and the whole ipso facto loss of office, which is promoted heavily in the Sedevacantist community. I didn't know at the time that there was other opinions of Bellarmine, by the way. I didn't even know that. So, part of that was my own fault, but you guys understand this. This is a process that's not very easy for a lot of people to go through.
Of course. Yeah.
So anyway, that's just a little more context as to how that all played out. And,
absolutely.
Sorry,
Well, real quick, could maybe John, if you want to chime in here about the ipso facto loss of office for heresy or modernism, as in, they're teaching things that are ambiguous and things like that. Could you maybe comment on how that works for the audience?
Sure. I want to first of all, commend Dan for his humility and his courage. This is just a wonderful, story that brings us all great joy. In terms of the ipso facto loss of office, you got to read Bellarmine. He said that in De Romano Pontifici, but there are many books and treatises that he wrote. Effectively, what Bellarmine meant by that is once the church determines that a pope is pertinacious in his heresy after canonical warnings and adjudicates him to be pertinacious, he would then at that moment, by the fact of the church's judgment, ipso facto, by the fact of the church's judgment, he would fall from his office. That position is distinguishable from the Dominican position, as we've called it, from Cajetan and John of St. Thomas, who argued for an additional step after the church, according to Cajetan and John of St. Thomas, after the church would determine the Pope is pertinacious in his heresy, he wouldn't fall from his office then. The Dominicans were very careful and judicious about not wanting to judge the Pope per se. But what this extra step is for the church then to declare to the church, the imperfect council perhaps, right? To declare to the universal church, to the faithful, that this man must be avoided. And so in the Bellarmine opinion, the ipso facto loss of office occurs after the church declares that the Pope is pertinacious, and hence the Pope has separated from the church, whereas the Dominicans hold that there's an extra step. We must declare the man to be avoided according to St. Paul's warning in Titus 3:10, right? Admonish the heretic twice and then avoid him. And in that case, it is the church separating from the Pope. So there's a subtle theological distinction, but ipso facto never means by the fact of private judgment. It always means by the authority who both gave us and enacted legislation on what constitutes the canonical crime of heresy, which is what causes the loss of office, is the same authority that has to interpret and apply the canonical elements to prove that there's a crime.
Gotcha. Yeah. So Bellarmine's position or the Dominican position, none of them are saying that a private determination that the Pope is a heretic by this person or that person results in a recognition of ipso facto loss of office. That's not what these theologians have ever taught. It's not what the church has ever believed. And it also, if that's the case, then anyone can say, "Well, it seems to me that."
Right.
And then what you do is you live your faith. You live in the Catholic Church apart from this visible structure, which is now corrupt and no longer the church. That's basically Protestantism, it sounds to me. So,
Yes,
great. So
that's right.
awesome. Dan, sorry, I just wanted to
Okay.
understand that better. So what happened next? Did you start like debating this with other people? Did you come across John's book? What happened?
Yeah, so I mean, I had debated with people in that chat room I was telling you guys about earlier for a long period of time. I mean, that was a number of years, but then eventually I moved on from that whole group, and so I actually found out about John's book when I was in the society. I actually, after a Saturday evening mass, I went down into the basement because in Pittsburgh at the society they actually have the social hall down in the basement. And they had a table with various books on them. Of course, the Open Letter to Confused Catholics was on that table as well. And I was looking at it and I saw the True or False Pope book, and I'm like, well, this looks interesting, because
You're familiar with that one, right?
yes, very familiar with that book.
Yeah. All kinds of things we could say about this.
You're absolutely right. And I actually would change the title of that book and say An Open Letter to Join My Schism. That really should be the real name of the book at this point. But but all kidding aside, and all joking aside, I found True or False Pope on that table, and I thought, okay, well, this looks interesting. So I started looking through it, and I actually sat down in the social hall there, and I'm reading through the book, and I was like, wow, this is a lot more in depth and more well thought out than I actually thought it would be. Because you typically think, okay, well, if people are trying to debate against Sedevacantists, a lot of the arguments that they use aren't very well thought out. They're kind of scattered, or people just don't put a lot of effort into trying to refute them. So I was actually really impressed with what John did in the book, and Robert too. I have to give Robert credit too. I can't forget him. And I was like, well, I want to take I want to buy the book and take it home. So that's actually what I ended up doing. And I mean, I'm not trained in theology formally by any means. I took general theology courses in college, but nothing higher level than that, obviously. So I was trying to just read through the book slowly and, try to process the information as I was going through it. And it really started to make me give it all a second look as far as Sedevacantism goes, because even though I wasn't 100% convinced at the time after reading the book yet, I was trying to figure out, well, what does God really want me to do? Why am I here? Why did he introduce Sedevacantism into my life? Why did he introduce these great people into my life? I had met some wonderful people. They're very good-willed. They have good intentions, but some of them were actually just raised as Sedevacantists. So that's all they knew. They never had like any other exposure to like the Novus Ordo Mass, or talking to diocesan Latin Mass goers and things like that. So I met some wonderful people along the way, and I kind of struggled with it for a few more years, and then it was actually in 2021. I think this was around the time when you were kind of starting to get ready to go and post your articles about the society, not having a mission, and not being sent by the church, and changing your position altogether with the society. So it was kind of around the same time as you were, getting ready to do all that. That I had been talking with the Sedevacantist priest one day after Mass, because they started a mission actually out here in Pittsburgh. They it was only about like 10 of us originally that were going to this mission, because driving 2 hours to go out to Mass in Akron, it's a long drive, and you spend a lot of money on gas and things like that. So it wasn't really ideal to be going out there every week for Mass anyway. So they, the priest and one of the parishioners out here organized a mission to do once a month. So it was actually at the mission after we had mass, and I'm talking with the priest, and he told me that he had only taken private vows, and I was actually I never knew that he had done that, so it was kind of like a red flag in my head, and I'm thinking, well, something doesn't seem right about that. I didn't know much about ordination rites. I'll admit I didn't do my homework on any of that kind of stuff when I should have, but I thought, okay, well, he was traditionally ordained, so he must be a Catholic priest, right? He must be at least validly ordained. That was the assumption. But then I started thinking about it on my drive home, like, he never told me this in, all the years that I've known him. Like, I never asked the question either, when I probably should have. But it started to make me really second guess it even more. And that's where I think, I was motivated to go back and read True or False Pope again, actually, and go through the book, go through John's articles on the website. And, I was really starting to have a change of heart at that point about all of it. And I actually started to go to Latin Mass at the local Institute of Christ the King, the diocesan Mass. And I noticed in the community there, I'm like, wow, these people really are serious about their faith. And you often hear in the Sedevacantist communities that these people are a joke, essentially. They don't take the Mass seriously, or they go to Mass, wearing jeans and the T-shirt, like you might see at the regular Novus Ordo Mass in some cases, where there are liturgical abuses that occur. But I was actually really surprised. I'm like, this is like going to basically like a society Mass, even a Sedevacantist Mass almost, without anyone bashing Vatican II or that sort of thing. But it was very similar. And, I was thinking, as I'm going and visiting the local diocesan Mass, I was thinking of John, I was thinking of the book. And, I heard rumors that John had gone back to the Novus Ordo. There was a rumor going around at the time. And I was like, well, that's interesting, that he would change his position on the society. Because I know that, I defended Archbishop Lefebvre for a number of years, thinking he was this hero. That's another thing about the society. They do a really good job selling Archbishop Lefebvre as a hero.
Yeah.
This guy that was like, he could do no wrong, essentially. He was the greatest.
It's like the rule of faith, Dan. It's like the rule of faith. But yeah, I mean, when they say I went back to the Novus Ordo, I had been attending the Institute of Christ the King the entire time. I was also going to the society on the weekends. I just stopped going to the society. But they do look at the Institute of Christ the King as part of the Novus Ordo Church, because it is part of the Roman Catholic Church, unlike the society.
Well, and it's funny too that you mentioned that the society was actually more convenient for me to go to, and I actually could have kept going there, but I actually stopped going there in 2018, just because I felt at the time, I'm like, after witnessing the third order ceremony, and we may have to explain that to the audience here a little bit about the third order. I had seen that ceremony. I'm like, well, this seems a little cultish. This seems like, these people are just blindly ready to just do whatever the society wants them to do, basically. And I was kind of, I was like, I don't really want to be a part of this anymore. It seems like a cult, the society, just everything was about Lefebvre. Everything was, he could do no wrong. If I questioned, the priest or anybody in the parish that was very loyal to the society, they didn't want to even discuss any of these sort of things, like any of the questions I had about Lefebvre and, his exchanging letters to Paul VI, and, why he was basically rebelling against Paul VI. They didn't want to talk about any of that really and explain why Lefebvre was even doing it. They kind of just wanted to say, hey, you know what? Just shut your mouth. Just go along with what the society wants. Archbishop Lefebvre, he's the greatest, and that's really all there was to it.
Yeah. So, okay. So it sounds like you moved from society to Sedevacantism. That was like a big step, and then from Sedevacantism through John's book back into the Novus Ordo Church. So, maybe talk a little bit more about what you saw that was wrong with the society from the Sedevacantist position.
Well, I mean, there was a number of things, like even the priest in Akron, he actually had a conference lecture that he did back in 2011, and I still have a copy of it, where he's actually making arguments against the society, because Archbishop Lefebvre in the society, I guess they promoted that Vatican II is not binding, it was just a pastoral council. And the Sedevacantism priest, I actually will admit, does a really good job of quoting Archbishop Lefebvre and Paul VI in their exchanges with their letters. And basically he's saying, well, this isn't the truth. I mean, if you're in the society, you actually have to adhere to Vatican II, because Paul VI is essentially saying that it is binding, even though they're saying, well, this was just a pastoral council. We don't have to really adhere to any of it. He was actually arguing, no, the society cannot do that. Actually, they actually have to adhere to Vatican II. And John, maybe you can, explain that better than me, obviously. But, as far as I understand it, yes, it was a pastoral council, but wouldn't it be considered infallible through the ordinary magisterium?
Yeah, Dan, I mean, to the extent that the council reiterated prior infallible church teaching, those teachings are infallible, not by virtue of the council itself, which wasn't exercising infallibility, but by virtue of the fact that the doctrines have been previously defined as either revealed truths or been proposed to be definitively held. So, that's one thing. I would say the other thing is, even though we call it a pastoral council, in my view, there are things in Vatican II that are binding. For example, the doctrinal teaching on collegiality and Lumen Gentium. Cardinal Bio long ago said that the dogma of collegiality is one of the clearest dogmas of the church. He actually referred to it as a dogma, and the fathers at Vatican I effectively had the schemas that were going to define what Vatican II ultimately defined in terms of the College of Bishops and the divine constitution of the church. Vatican I focused on the primacy. Vatican II now focuses on the episcopate, or the College of Bishops. That, to me, is a pretty definitive teaching so I don't think you can simply, judge the council as it's pastoral and we can throw it out like that. That's absolutely not true. And as we also know, the reason why the society rejects the profession of faith is that, even assuming all of the teachings of Vatican II, which I don't, but even assuming all of them are, quote, non-definitive, there's still teachings of the authentic magisterium that require our religious submission of intellect and will, which the society is refusing to give. According, the Sedevacantists also refuse to give that submission. So, a couple points of clarification.
Sometimes it seems to me the whole debate over whether it's infallible or not almost misses the point. The real question, I think, is it authoritative? Now, I don't think it's not important, because I think the magisterium subsequently could probably clarify things. But is it authoritative? Yes. So, as Catholics, we give assent. That's third paragraph teachings included. So, yeah.
So it was things like that where, in this case, the Sedevacantist priest, at least from the arguments he was using against the society, were actually right. But the irony was he also rejects those same things.
Yeah.
I started to notice that as well. And, I think one of the other things too that's important to understand about Sedevacantism, at least being around these people, is that they truly believe that they are what's left of the Catholic Church. They don't believe that the hierarchy is there anymore, as far as cardinals and, everybody's basically a modernist. Everybody's corrupt. And, one thing that I know that Father Cicada, which, you both are, you're familiar with, the audience, they may not know who he was. He passed away a couple of years ago. I think it was in 2020, if I remember right. He was arguing against true or false pope, of course, as some of us
Not
know.
very well. Not very well.
And, Father Cicada also was one of the guys out there saying, okay, well, their ordinations and the new ordination rite aren't valid, and I actually was starting to believe in this stuff, during, that transition period where, between 2016 and 2017, where I, was reading some of Father Cicada's material, and, I had many people saying, "Oh, Father Cicada, he's great. He's one of the best resources in the church," meaning Sedevacantist church, to reference. And so, I started actually, when I'd be driving by diocesan churches, I'd be looking at them. I'd be like, "Wow, this is crazy. These guys aren't even real Catholic priests." Like, I was actually starting to believe this stuff, and a lot of people can fall into that trap with the whole new ordination rite being invalid. And that's one of their biggest arguments. They're saying, okay, well, these people are not actually Catholic priests. But the irony is, once you go through John's material, and you start realizing, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense what they're arguing, because they actually don't have valid orders themselves. They actually don't even have a valid ordination because they didn't even have, the bishop didn't have jurisdiction, ordinary jurisdiction to do any of that. And then supplied jurisdiction comes up. I don't know if, I'm assuming a lot of members of this audience would probably know what that means, but the supplied jurisdiction is one of their biggest points, saying we actually have supplied jurisdiction. Even the Sedevacantist priest from Akron, he says, I have supplied jurisdiction. And John obviously can explain better than I can why they don't have supplied jurisdiction. Yeah. But, I started second guessing all that after reading True or False Pope again the second time.
Excellent. John, do you want to maybe unpack some of those things for the audience?
Sorry, John, we're making you work a little bit.
No, not at all. It's your show tonight, Dan, but I'm happy to jump in. Supply jurisdiction very, very simply means that if we're going to talk about common error, it would mean that the Catholic community would make a judgment that the priest in question has an habitual faculty from the bishop. Okay, now no Sedevacantist community could possibly conclude that their priest has habitual faculties from the bishop in the territory in which they illicitly operate. Okay, so they have totally perverted the meaning of supplied jurisdiction. They've taken it out of the Catholic understanding and put it into a vacuum to try to apply it to their fact situation, but it doesn't, because number one, they're not the Catholic community. The Catholic community is the community that is intended to be protected by supplied jurisdiction, not those sects that are separate from the Catholic Church. And number two, that community would never err that their own priests have habitual jurisdiction, because the priests themselves tell their communities they don't have habitual jurisdiction, they have supplied jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. You see, so it's a gross perversion of the meaning of supplied jurisdiction.
Yeah, John's absolutely right. The Sedevacantist priest, he even admitted to me, he said, I do not have ordinary jurisdiction at all. I have supplied jurisdiction because of the crisis in the church. Yeah. Necessity, as we know, necessity knows no law, is often quoted from St. Thomas Aquinas by many of these people. They're saying, well, St. Thomas, he says that necessity knows no law. So therefore, we have that supplied jurisdiction from God himself, because the hierarchy is corrupt. The modernists, they're never going to get rid of these anti-popes. You hear all sorts of arguments like that, and it actually gets to be exhaustive at a certain point whenever you're going through all this yourself. You're trying to think, okay, well, who's actually right here? This is a mess. Vatican II created such a mess. I actually was becoming an anti-Vatican II guy for a number of years there. I was like, it's the worst council that ever happened. It's the worst thing that ever happened to the church. Yeah. But now that, when I go back and I compare what John has written on collegiality, and then I think about the Society's podcast and some of the episodes, which, John, I'm sure you're familiar with. You've listened to those episodes.
Yes.
It just amazes me that they don't seem to see collegiality in the same regard that you do at all. Like they don't acknowledge any of it. I mean, they essentially ignore the council itself. So anyway, there's obviously a lot that we could say as far as what people argue, and we're not going to get into all these petty arguments, but yeah. So at that point in 2021, I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm still going to the Sedevacantist mission, not as often, a little less often than I was, not once or twice a month, maybe once every 2 months, 3 months. It was starting to spread out, and I actually ended up starting to go out of convenience, just because it was closer to my home, a Ukrainian Catholic church, an Eastern Rite church. And, I think that one of the things that people often forget about is our brothers and sisters in the East. They don't even consider that as an option. If they're like, well, I don't want to attend the Novus Ordo Mass, right? Because I just don't like it. Or, some people still are, I guess, essentially convinced from Archbishop Lefebvre and others that, there's a lot of errors. It's inherently, it might even be evil to attend a Novus Ordo Mass. And, obviously the Sedevacantists, they tell you don't go to any Novus Ordo Mass. It's a black Mass, essentially. It's evil. It goes against everything that the church, as far as liturgical customs, it goes against everything that Pius XII and others, they'll say, they'll quote Mediator Dei, the encyclical, and say, well, Pius XII never wanted the tabernacle separated from the altar. He never wanted us to go back to a plain table altar. They'll use arguments like that. So anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to get on a little rant there, but
No, you're good.
I started thinking, okay, well, this is a good option for me just because it's literally a mile from my house, which is very, very nice, especially if you have kids like I do. And, I got to know the priest there, and, I started explaining, what Sedevacantism was, because the priest didn't even know. He was like, I just want to get to know you. And, we started to get to know each other and started talking. And he was like, he was like, a little more than my average parishioners. Some of them, a little more. I'm not going to say I know a lot. Obviously, I'm not like you guys where I've spent 20 years doing apologetics or anything like that, or had like a really formal study of theology. So, it was nice, a nice compliment from him. But, I told him what Sedevacantism was about. We talked about the SSPX, which actually he admitted in seminary school. He, had heard about the society, and I guess they were telling them like, hey, this is a schismatic group, and this is why you should avoid them. But I actually told him to check out John's material, and he's been watching your videos recently, and he said it was very helpful, so I was happy to hear that. But anyway, so I want to make sure I don't lose track of what I was trying to say here as far as the story.
Yeah. Well, so yeah, that really helps to see how like Sedevacantism and the society's positions have many similarities, but also, one's more consistent in a certain area, which is that you can't just resist the authoritative teachings of the magisterium. It's either the magisterium or it's not, and then the other is like consistent when it comes to the continuity of the visible structure in the sense of Vatican I says perpetuity, even though they are, even the society, divorcing the visible and invisible. But anyway, that's just me kind of recapping, because that's really helpful to see the two different positions here. But what really did it for you to like lead you back into the Catholic Church, right? The larger Catholic Church, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Well, it was, I have to give John and True or False Pope and Robert a lot of credit for the book. That really was a big part of it. And, I think going to the diocesan Latin Mass, seeing that these people actually take their faith very seriously, that it's not just some joke, like, the regular Novus Ordo masses, as they say, they call it a joke or a clown mass. There's a whole bunch of nicknames for it. But I think that it was prayer. It was me asking God, okay, well, guide me to the truth. Who's really right here?
Yeah.
And, just trying to discern it without, formal education in philosophy, formal training in any of these things. I thought, okay, I'm going to just take a leap of faith essentially and just go with whatever God, which direction he wants me to go in this case. And, that was part of it, I think, but just reinforcing the doubts that I was starting, because I had internal conflict. I'm thinking, okay, is John Salzo actually right here? Is he wrong? And then trying to cross-reference some of the material that he was presenting about Bellarmine, just doing my own research on it. I think that helped ultimately get me over the finish line, so to speak. So John, I have to thank you, of course, for writing the book, because I think if you'd never written the book, I would have never even started second guessing any.
I share the credit. Yeah, I share the credit with Robert Cisco, who's just a phenomenal resource on this material as well. If I don't, Dom, could I just ask Dan? You mentioned something, Dan, I thought that was really interesting about the fact that the Society of St. Pius X has now created its own third order apostolate. Not unlike actual religious orders that have lay people in them, such as the Dominicans, that have been founded on proper ecclesiastical authority, but they have in fact established their own third order. And you said that struck you as very problematic. I want to comment on that, but I want to get more from you on that. Tell us about that.
Well, I was there for Sunday Mass attending, and at the time the priest there was Father Patrick Rutledge, who was actually considered an expert on Sedevacantism in the society. By the way, he was considered one of their best guys to argue against it. So it was good to have him around actually at that time as a reference. But I'd been there for Mass. It was Sunday Mass. They did it right after the Mass ended. And I'm like, well, what is this? I've never even heard of this third order. I was watching the ceremony, and as I'm watching the ceremony, I'm just like, this seems just very like odd, like very cultish. I don't really know what other word to use for it. Like, these people are essentially swearing their allegiance to promoting the society and doing their bidding, essentially their will.
Wow.
I'm sitting there just thinking, well, this is, I've never heard of this. I've never seen anything like this. I never had seen a ceremony done after a Mass like that, where you're kind of initiating someone. It actually kind of reminded me of almost like a Masonic sort of ceremony, in the sense that, you have all these people gathered, for witnesses, and, you're kind of just seeing like one person up there as the candidate, and the priest is there, just going through the motions of the ceremony. And I don't know, I just had a really bad feeling about it. I don't know if it was God trying to tell me, hey, this is wrong. There's something bad about this. I just, after I'd seen that ceremony, I'm like, I don't think I can go back to the society anymore. There's something wrong with it. This seems like a cult. Everything's about Lefebvre. Everything is, he's infallible, essentially.
Dom, I think this raises a very interesting issue, and I'm so glad Dan brought it up. I have called this movement the false counter church of tradition, this church of tradition. And one of the things that the false church of tradition has is its own phony religious orders. Okay. We can talk about the Society of St. Pius X itself, who evidently had a legitimate Dominican that somehow broke off from the Dominican order through Archbishop Lefebvre, founded the Dominicans of Avrier. And Andrew Bartel can speak in more detail about this, because he was actually out there for a year. But then you had another Dominican priest break off of Avrier and start his own Dominican order, all under the so-called authority of the Society of St. Pius X. I bring this up, Dan and Don, because I myself was deceived by that. I wanted to be a Dominican for a very long time. I grew up reading St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Catherine of Siena. I went to Dominican high school. I was introduced to Dominican spirituality at a very young age. And when I was affiliated with the society, one of their so-called Dominican priests approached me about it. We talked about it, and he actually received me into the Dominicans in 2016, whereby I gave a commitment before the Blessed Sacrament and received the Dominican scapular. I was following the Dominican rule. And as I became more conversant with the things that we're talking about, specifically canon law and how, religious orders, and Dan, there are third orders all over the place, religious orders such as the Dominicans have what they call lay Dominicans. We say that, you can call it a third order. We call it lay Dominicans. Even priests who are diocesan priests could become third order Dominicans, if you will. I think St. Louis de Montfort was one of them. But this all has to be done with the blessing of the church on ecclesiastical authority. And I've never mentioned this before, but one of the things that struck me is, because of contacts in Rome, I reached out to the superior general of the entire worldwide Dominican order in Rome. And I said, hey, here's a certificate I was received in the Dominicans. Can you validate this for me? And they said, John, we've never heard of this priest who is parading around as a Dominican under the imprimatur of the Society of St. Pius X. I said, you're kidding me. So thankfully, I was able to go through the Dominicans and actually have everything regularized with the Central Province and St. Albert the Great. But this is just another example of the deception of this false church of tradition. False Benedictines, false Dominicans, false third orders. I mean, this is very problematic. It does not have the ecclesiastical authority or blessing of the church. And one of the society priests told me this, Dan, and he told me this years ago. This wasn't recent, but he told me this years ago when the society established the third order. You know what this priest told me? He said, John, I'm counseling priests and entering the third order, and every time somebody joins the society third order, they experience tremendous and excruciating suffering. And I can't explain why, but that must just be part of the salvific process. And I thought to myself, maybe not. Maybe there's something else going on here that's not supernatural, but more diabolical.
one thing that I find interesting is that an argument that society will make sometimes is that we're not claiming to have ordinary jurisdiction, just supplied jurisdiction. Then why do you have these erected orders and third orders? If you don't have ordinary jurisdiction, like, is this right, John? Like that wouldn't be
Correct.
warranted under supplied jurisdiction.
No,
It's
no way. I
completely
mean,
different.
completely different. I mean, supplied jurisdiction can apply to acts of governance, but again, it's either based on common error, where a Catholic community would believe the priest has ordinary faculties to bring them into an order, or we didn't talk about the other element, which could be positive and probable doubt, where the priest, in general, the priest would believe concretely that he had the authority, the ecclesiastical authority. You see, so supplied jurisdiction has no application whatsoever, to these phony religious orders, to this phony schismatic tribunal where they dispense with religious vows and lift censures and declare marriage annulments, et cetera. It has no place in any of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's actually good that you mentioned the tribunals as well, John, because I remember reading, through your material, that was one of the other things that I had concerns about with the society. I'm thinking, well, okay, these guys are kind of operating on their own. They don't really have Rome's blessing. I mean, I've seen the quotes from Benedict XVI where, he even said that they had no canonical status in the church. The local bishop here in Pittsburgh has spoken out against the society many times, saying that they're in schism. These guys don't have our blessing to do anything around here, basically. So it's that whole counter church, that whole independent independent Catholicism is probably the right term or phrase, way to say it. I think that's another reason why when I was thinking about all this, I'm thinking, okay, what about the 4 marks of the church? Do these independent churches have any of those marks?
Great point.
And they don't. And that's the sad thing about it, is these people really believe that they do have it. I had recently watched the interview with Bishop Mark Pivarunis, who I'm sure you're very familiar with, John.
Yes.
CMRI. And he's talking about how they're getting ready to expand further into Canada, and they're growing. And, I can personally tell you that I've witnessed the growth since Traditionis Custodes happened. The motu proprio, for those who in the audience who might not be familiar with that, I'm assuming most people would be, restricting the Latin Mass in some cases. But, the other thing too is when you think about these restrictions on the Latin Mass, now that, that comes to mind, people forget that we have the Eastern rites as an option. If they don't want to go to the Novus Ordo, they can go to the Eastern rites. It's still a Catholic church, even though a lot of people say, well, it looks like an Orthodox church. It's not an Orthodox church. I've had arguments with people about this, over the years, where they're like, no, it's an Orthodox church. I'm like, no, it's not. But anyway, that's just a little side note, side comment there. But
Excellent.
I think when people, my appeal to people would be look, I'm not trying to tell you guys what to believe or what to do. Ultimately, you decide what you want to do, where you want to go to Mass, what you want to believe. But do these independent Catholic churches, as we'll call them, counter churches, Protestant-like churches, they have their own internal schisms. You have the SSP5 and these other groups that don't agree with the CMRI and, various things. I would encourage people to really think about, okay, do they actually have the 4 marks of the Catholic Church? Do they have local ordinaries? Do they have bishops? And some of them will say, yeah, we have a bishop, right? We have Bishop Pivarunis, or we have Bishop, he's passed away, Bishop Dolan, Sanborn, these other guys that are out there. But as far as I understand it, John, you can correct me if I'm wrong, they don't have any jurisdiction at all, and not even supplied. I mean, they don't have authority to do really anything.
Yeah, Dan, that's one of the key issues, right? Often Sedevacantists will tell us where the church is not, but they can't tell us where the true Roman Catholic Church is. And I would say, where are the 4 marks? You're mentioning this mark of apostolicity. Now, it may be the case, and it probably is the case, where the Sedevacantist bishops have material apostolic succession because they received valid episcopal consecration, but they don't have formal apostolic succession, which means they've been given a canonical mission from the Pope through which they're faculties that they've received interiorly become, licit and true powers that are ready to act. And so, the apostolicity of the church means that the church will always have formal apostolic succession, which means ordinary jurisdiction from Christ to the Pope and to the bishops. That's what the church will always have. And these separate sects, Sedevacantist sect, to be sure, may have the line of episcopal consecration, but there's not legitimate apostolic succession because there's no ordinary jurisdiction there.
That's very helpful, John. In fact, I mean, it kind of answers Lysandra's question, which is where do SEDE priests go to seminary? You guys can take up the answer, but it seems to me they're just normal priests who go to normal seminaries or society seminaries who end up becoming Sedevacantists and independent.
Well, yeah, the Sedevacantists, the MRI, they have their own seminary that they set up, just like the SSPX.
Yeah.
It's out in, I believe it's in Nebraska. I can't remember which state right now, but it's somewhere out in the Midwest. And they set up their own seminaries. They have seminary professors, people teaching theology, helping the priests get their formation. They're going to claim, well, we're actually teaching, neo-scholastic theology. We're teaching Thomism. We're teaching, the true faith here, so to speak, or giving these priests a great formation for their future. In some cases, I believe a lot of these guys that are entering these seminaries really have good intentions. They think that they're just keeping the Catholic faith as it was always taught in the past. But unfortunately, they don't think about authority. They don't think about jurisdiction. They don't think about, okay, does this church, how can our church have a 60-year vacancy and still function as a church? They're going to say, well, there was the Western Schism, right? The Great Western Schism. But that was only, a 3 or 4 year ordeal, if I recall correctly. It wasn't a really long period of time in between. You actually had a true pope in that case, but there were claimants. But I think the longest actual Sedevacantis or Sedevacante that occurred as far as an actual vacancy was like 3 to 4 years in church history, if I recall correctly. And I could be totally wrong on this.
I thought it was a year.
It's less than 3 years.
Okay, less than 3.
So that's another thing. That's another thing I was thinking about as I'm going through all this. I'm thinking, okay, well, if these guys are actually right, if they're actually telling the truth, then God is just supposed to give us a pope at some point. Like, there's no solution. I even raised the point to the priest at one point. I'm saying, well, why don't we go back and take the Vatican back then? Why don't we infiltrate the Vatican? And he said to me, well, we can't use the devil's tactics to win this war.
Wow.
Well, yeah, he's saying we can't do that. We can't use the devil's tactics, because these modernists, they stole the church from us. They took it over. And I think about the whole Cardinal Siri thesis. I'm sure some people in the audience, they're familiar with that whole thing. And unfortunately, a lot of people in the Sedevacantist community give credibility to it. They think it might be real or it might be true that, Cardinal Siri was the true pontiff, and he was essentially forced into quitting right there at the conclave. And, I'm not going to get on a rant about that whole 58 conclave, but John, you know why I'm bringing this up, because
for sure.
There's a lot of sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, Dan, when you were in the Sedevacantist trap, where did you think the Roman Catholic Church was if it wasn't the Church of Rome and all the dioceses united to her? Where was it in your mind?
Well, in my mind, I thought, okay, well, you have, Bishop Ivarunas and a few of these other bishops, right? They do have chapels in other countries. They do have, bishops in other countries, as far as I'm aware. In some cases, I think the CMRI is about to get a bishop in Europe finally. So I'm thinking, okay, well, if this is what's left of the Church of Pius XII, right?
Yeah.
Then we at least have bishops to keep it, the whole thing going.
But they weren't ordained, but they weren't consecrated by Pius XII.
No, they weren't.
So if Pius XII was the last valid pope, and only a pope can validly choose, select, consecrate, and send a bishop, how can they be legitimate bishops?
Well, you know about the whole Archbishop Thuk story, I'm sure, and they'll say, well, Archbishop Thuk had permission from Pius XII to not have, he didn't need a papal mandate to do these consecrations. Okay. They'll say, well, it never expired. Paul VI, he never canceled that, that permission for Archbishop Thuk to do these consecrations, so they're valid. So that means that the church continues on because Archbishop Thuk, he consecrated a few bishops, and everything's great.
And they may have been valid. I'm not saying they are or aren't, but they're not legitimate because there was no canonical mission given to the bishops by the Holy Father, right? So it does, I think, boil down to, even with regard to my own errors on the society, it does boil down to ecclesiology and understanding what the church is and the nature of the church, because we can debate all of the issues about whether a pope can fall into heresy, and if he does, how is that determined, right? But the bottom line for our Sedevacantist friends is, you can show that you're not part of the Catholic Church because you're all divided from the church and government. Okay, that's the key. If you look at Pius XII's teaching in Mystici Corpus Christi, he says those who are not living in the unity of the body, those who are divided in government, are not living in the unity of the body, nor in the one divine spirit. There you go. What is the body? The body is, of course, the visible structure, the visible hierarchical juridical reality, which is the Roman Catholic Church. And those like the Sedevacantists and the Society of St. Pius X and all the independents, because they are divided from the church, from her government, they are not part of the Catholic Church. You start there. Show a Sedevacantist, you're not in the Catholic Church, you're not part of the Catholic Church, outside of which there's no salvation. Now we can talk about the Pope heresy issue, but I think that is a key issue that has to be addressed up front.
No, you're absolutely right, John. The papacy really is the central issue for Sedevacantists. The whole the see is vacant issue, and they really believe that there is no pope, there is no formal hierarchy anymore, because they all became modernists. They all fell away from the faith. Yeah. So, I want to say one thing too. I don't want to forget this. A lot of the Sedevacantists, they promote conspiracy theories, and they also use I would categorize it as childish attacks against John. And I do want to point this out, because I know that there's going to be somebody out there that'll post a comment on this video, coming up with some sort of conspiracy saying that, I'm assisting the New World Order, or, in this takeover of, Roman Catholicism. I'm acting against the true faith, against the church, and all kinds of crazy things might come up. But I just want to say, in John's defense, when people use these really weak or childish arguments against John, I think it's really unfortunate. That's all I'll say. I'm not going to get into a long rant about it. I just hope that the members in the audience understand that this is a serious topic. John takes it seriously, and I think that some of the comments that people post about him on some of his videos out there are just very unfair.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Occupational hazard, but thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's quite something, because I get notified. I finally turned it off a while back, but I get notified when I get new comments, and it was driving me completely mad. So I just decided to turn that thing off. So yeah.
So, in conclusion, because I really appreciate you guys taking time to talk with me. I know John's very busy. I'm sure you're busy, Dom. I'm sure there's some things I forgot to mention or say, just because I'm not used to being on camera. So
you're good.
I do appreciate that. You guys took time to talk with me, but I really want the members in the audience to consider, if they're going, especially with, Pope Francis and the whole situation that's going on with, people starting to doubt him because they think he's a modernist or a liberal, whatever you want to call it. I think people really need to think about, okay, well, his conclave was never challenged by any cardinals. No one ever said it was illegal, invalid. There was universal acceptance, which John's very familiar with. Dom, you're familiar with it. I would make that point to say, okay, look, we're going to go through some tough times here in the church, especially this time of in church history. This is a really crazy period of time, but Christ, he made his promise that the gates of hell will never prevail against his church. And we just have to not be tempted to join independent Catholic groups that are essentially Protestant-like in their ecclesiology and nature. They don't have any authority from Christ himself to really even have a mission to operate. If I'm saying that incorrectly, John, please correct me. But
awesome.
But I really want the members of the audience, if you're being tempted like I was, don't take the society's word for everything. Archbishop Lefebvre was not infallible. He made a lot of mistakes. Unfortunately, he was wrong about quite a few things, as John points out in True or False Pope and on his website in the videos. I pray for everybody who's confused right now. I pray for the church. I pray for John. I pray for Dom. I pray that we just get through this and, we just die in a state of grace and ultimately go to heaven. That's the end game for me.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate you sharing your story and your insights. That's awesome, man. Thanks so much for coming on the show. And I think this is going to be helpful for the audience and for people who are on the fence, really, and who are reading, Cicada or other Sedevacantists. And, pick up John's book, True or False Pope. Yeah, that's a good plug here for John and Robert's.
Well, don't forget your podcast too, Dom. I mean, you're episode 89. That's an excellent episode.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm getting to that. Speaking of which, if you guys enjoy this content and you want to support us, you can go to patreon.com/the Logos Project. It would be very helpful. I'm a full-time student. The money goes into making the show better and paying the subscriptions on the podcast platform and getting new books and stuff like that. So thank you all so much. John, thank you again for joining us as
Thank
well. Any parting words? You pretty much already. Any last insight, Dan?
Yeah, I actually don't want to forget. If you're looking out on Novus Ordo Watch, look, I have nothing against Mario personally. I actually consider him a friend still. I don't think he'll be talking to me much anymore. But if you're going on that website, there are some things that are truthful, and there are other things that are going to confuse you as far as where to go next. If you're questioning, okay, well, should I stay with Pope Francis? Should I, go to these independent chapels, the society especially, because they still recognize the Pope, right? So they say, but then they rebel against his authority. Ultimately, is what happens. So if you're going out to that website, Mario Dirksen is a good guy at heart, but he's got his beliefs. He really believes that Sedevacantism is the truth. But like I said, I'm not going to speak ill about him. I think he's trying to act in good faith, but I would not recommend going out to that website for your information. Go talk to your local bishop. Go out to websites that are more credible, like your local diocese or the Vatican's website, if you need to read encyclicals and things like that. Because the Sedevacantists, they will try to spin some things in their favor. I mean, everybody's going to try to win people over to their position if they can. But I will say, just be careful with what you read online. Always consult with your bishop locally first if you're going to, if you're confused about anything, or your local priest, and try to get the answers from them instead of going out through independent sources.
Excellent. Wonderful. John, any last things? Any last words? Nope.
Again, right. I commend Dan, for the humility and the courage. It's a great step. There are certain people and apostolates out there like 1 Peter 5 that criticize people for changing their mind. But sometimes when the mind is changed for the better and for the truth, we all give glory to God for that. So congrats, Dan. It's glad to have you on the team.
Thank you very much. And both you, I hope you both have a great rest of your evening, and God bless you.
God bless. Thanks so much, Dan. Thanks, John. See you guys later.